I'm Hannah.
And I'm Hanna.
And this is Horror Hour with the Hannas.
Where if it terrifies, we talk about it.
Okay, I see you. Trying on a new intro.
I got a couple lined up, so stay tuned.
Were you getting bored with the previous?
Yeah, I've been inspired by other people's taglines, and ours is kind of
It's rusty
boring.
Now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just going to get them dumber and dumber as I go every week.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'm down for it.
Okay.
I'm glad you didn't choose a totally dumb one for this week, though, because we're talking about a very important topic. So this week we are talking about mental health narratives in horror. The reason why we picked this topic is because September is National Suicide Prevention Month, and September 10th, the date of this episode's release, is actually World Suicide Prevention Day. And as someone who is very passionate about mental health, mental illness narratives in film, but also works in the field and has a degree in mental health counseling, this is a topic that's really important to me, so I really wanted to use our platform to shed light on it.
Yeah, and I would say the analysis of trauma and
mental illness narratives
in horror is even like a reason we started the podcast in the first place. It was something that interested both of us that we thought was pretty prevalent within the genre, and we thought we could do a good job talking about it.
And I feel like the first movie that I saw in theaters that really got me thinking along those lines, I remember when we saw Split, I was like, geez Louise, this is so offensive to me. I have to rant about it to everyone. Mm-hmm. So it was one of those where I knew we would talk about it eventually, and we got to it kind of early on in the podcast. So,
well, I was going to say we have an episode on it, so go listen if you want to hear us talk about M. Night Shyamalan's Split.
Yeah, Shyamalan has some very interesting mental health portrayals. I love him, but that's not his strong suit.
That's the thing is, sure. Like, I like Split, and I talked about it in the episode, so you can go listen there. I think
Split is a perfectly fun movie, but damn,
with a lot of issues.
It has a lot of problems. Yeah. I will say, obviously, this is an incredibly important but nuanced topic. We all have different personal experiences with mental illness and different life experiences, cultures, etc. that can obviously contribute to how we read a film. So we and our contributors to this episode may have differences in opinion about what makes for good or bad representation. But obviously that's okay, because like I said, we're all coming from different places with how we read these films. We also did want to note that, unless otherwise stated, our contributors don't work in mental health, and therefore we are not here to give advice or to diagnose. We're just here to shed light on this incredibly important topic.
In movies.
In movies. Or shows, if that comes up.
Okay, true. No books, though. No readers here.
Books did not come up in this episode. But,
if you want to read a book, go read one. Don't listen to a podcast.
Well, we have some podcast episodes about books.
I know.
Also,
I read one.
And we will be having an episode coming up in the next month or two that's about a horror novel. So, yeah.
Facts. Guess which one it is. We're not going to tell you for a little bit.
I posted it on our story, so some people might already know, but that's fine.
We'll see if they're paying attention then.
They aren't. It's fine, though. I don't mind. But like we did mention, we do have some podcast friends that are joining for this episode. They submitted clips talking about mental health, mental illness narratives in horror, so I'm glad that we get to hear from a number of people. But for us now, to introduce the episode, I did want to ask you, Matt, why do you feel that so many films touch on issues of mental illness, societal stressors, etc. in this genre?
Well, so easy answer is that horror movies are about fear, right? Mm-hmm. And horror. I think it's a pretty easy conversion of, trauma, mental illness, societal pressures that can all be put within the constraints of a film and lead to some really interesting and relatable narratives. So that's easy answer, right? Second, more complex answer is that I believe that horror movies can act as both a catharsis for the creators of the films, for them to express their own traumas or their own illness or their own feelings on those topics. And it's also a sense of catharsis for the viewer to experience those things and experiencing those feelings or those relatable ideas and feelings in a safe way, in a safe and non-dangerous way that's on the screen, right?
I agree. I have a lot of anxieties as a person, and when I watch a horror movie, it does get me physically feeling those like symptoms of anxiety a lot of times. but I like that it can just go away.
It's a controlled environment.
Like, it's controlled, it's fun, it's not gonna sit with me, and I'm not gonna stew over it forever. I like that it's, like you said, it's cathartic that way.
And I think horror movies in general, similar to like a thrill ride, is a controlled anxiety or a controlled and safe way to feel almost simulated danger, or in this case, simulated anxieties, fears, traumas. And I think that's really cool that creators can explore those ideas and feelings, and they can share them with us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think historically, horror has always served that purpose. I mean, even think back to Frankenstein and Dracula, Night of the Living Dead. Like, these are all movies that they're not new by any means, but they're all expressing some sort of like societal discomfort or fear that we have. I think horror has always been political because it uses fear to explore these societal flaws, anxieties, power structures, etc.
And it's funny you say that, because a lot of people would argue that that's like a more recent thing with elevated horror, which is why I think that term's really dumb, because all horror by that definition is elevated, right? Maybe not all. Friday the 13th is not super elevated, but a lot of it. And it's not a new thing. It's been a thing for a while that like it's horror that is exploring deep themes and deep interpersonal themes. It's a very common thing to do. So,
and I think the movies that do that versus just sitting there trying to be fun, I like a fun time. That's cool too. But the movies that mean something, I think, resonate with me, and I think about them far, far longer.
The best are the ones that can do both. Like, I look at look at Scream. It has probably some political stuff to say, but more it's meta commentary on all previous horror. It's meta commentary on actually schlocky horror for the most part, which is kind of interesting looking at it that way. But I digress. So, what are some movies that you think fall under this category that you really like?
Well, first, I did want to say on our show, we have covered a number of films that may not portray topics around mental illness in the best light. In our personal opinion, think Split, as we mentioned, Trap, Smile, American Psycho, Malignant, The Dark and the Wicked, The Woman in the Yard. But I did want to say, obviously, it doesn't make you a bad person for liking these films. We like some of these films because we have a good time, or they're well made.
Number one fan.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's representing what it's trying to, or it's accidentally representing things in a sinister way that I don't agree with. But since you asked for some good films, one of the filmmakers that I think reflects different societal or cultural concerns that can be contributors to anxiety, depression, trauma, etc., is obviously Jordan Peele. All three of his horror films really do a great job of representing different societal issues, whether that's race or economics. I think especially Us, I did want to highlight because we have a full episode on that, and I think our deep dive is really great. But I think that this is a really brilliant way of capturing privilege and how being born into a certain social class will ultimately impact your trajectory throughout your life. It will impact what traumas you endure. It will impact what education you get. It will impact everything.
You don't have to tell me twice. I'm a huge fan of Us, even though I think a lot of people think it's one of his weakest. There are days that it's my favorite. So
I think it is by far his most fun. I think I can agree that it's messy compared to the other two, but that doesn't mean that I don't think it's doing something extremely valuable.
I completely agree.
I think When Evil Lurks is a great example of a more recent film that kind of shows government incompetence and how government decisions will impact our overall functioning, and that can very much contribute to anxiety, trauma, etc. And we do have a full episode on that, so I don't need to dive too deep. Do you have any other examples that are coming to mind about government incompetence and how ultimately that will impact us individually?
Well, Alien is very much about, people being disposable and big corporations abusing them, basically. So
Great pick.
That's one that just popped into my head when you said government incompetence, and I was like, well, there you go.
Well, Alien is also a great pick for films that talk about sexual trauma or ultimately women's bodily autonomy, which is a theme we've been seeing for decades, but especially last year we got two films on that specifically just in 1 year. And two major films that were very, very similar,
Prometheus does it too. You know I love Prometheus.
Last year, like I was saying, we had the first Omen and we had Immaculate. One of those is far better than the other. But yeah, like you said, we have Prometheus. We have the entire Alien franchise.
Saga,
yeah. Even Titan, it has this like really interesting pregnancy narrative.
Yes. You could do just a whole episode on pregnancy narratives in horror. Maybe that's the next collab.
Definitely could do that. And one of the creators that contributed to this episode is also going to talk about narratives related to infertility or difficulty, having children or being parents, which I think is a really beautiful topic to explore as well. So I will let them get into that in more depth. There's also a ton of horror films about like the male gaze and violence against women. So some of the ones that I pieced out was Watcher.
Great film.
I absolutely love Watcher and its portrayal of, the general anxiety that women have, feeling like we're being watched, and what happens if those around us don't believe us and don't provide us with the support that we need to stay safe. There's obviously The Invisible Man, which is very, very much about domestic violence and gaslighting.
Yep.
And of course, Barbarian, which is one of my absolute favorites of the 2020s, is very, very much about dangers against women that come in all shapes and sizes.
I got an old one for you, since we're talking about voyeurism and all that. Rear Window. While I do think that's a movie about the nature of film, it is also very much about male gaze, watching other people, as we said, and then violence against women.
Mm-hmm. Agree. Great shout. Thank you.
Great shout. I wanted to point out that we were naming a lot of new movies, but this is not a new thing, as I was saying before.
You're
so
correct.
I'm racking my brain for all my old pulls that I can get.
No, thank you for that, because I am more prone to finding newer things.
Movies. Yep.
Yeah. Another topic I did want to mention too, which I think could have its own episode as well, but addiction and substance use narratives, I think, are really interesting in horror as well.
Love that in horror. Oh, I got to name one.
I know which one you're going to say. Go ahead.
Evil Dead 2013, which I keep shouting out as a movie that I love and I really want us to cover. But Evil Dead 2013 is such a cool setup because it's taking me like original format of them going to the cabin. But the reason they're going to the cabin is because their friend is detoxing off of heroin. And that's they're taking her there for that reason. And I think it's such an interesting narrative to align like demonology, or not demonology, but possession with drug addiction. And though that's like a more, I would love to see another movie that does almost that exactly, because I think that works so well to like almost equate drug addiction to a sense of like demonic possession.
Well, you did mention that actually when we talked about Talk to Me.
Facts.
Yeah.
I'm so smart.
On No Bodies. Yeah. That also kind of serves as a bit of an addiction narrative. I was also going to point out, obviously, Smile 2. While I did not like the portrayal of mental health in Smile, I think a lot of my issues are corrected in Smile 2. And I like that the portrayal of our main character in her substance use recovery.
Yeah, very, very true. And I also like Smile 2. Another one we have an episode on, so go listen to it.
Yes. Climax.
Oh, yeah.
It's very much about the consequences of substance use and the anxieties around substance use.
Maybe not as...
it's not as nuanced.
Yes, it's a great movie, though.
But I know you love that movie, so I just needed to put that in there. And finally, I also did want to add The Haunting of Hill House, which I think has a very nuanced perspective of how a family relates and reacts to having a family member that is active in their addiction or then in their recovery. I think the way it's handled there and how you have multiple different siblings and see multiple insights, I think is really interesting, as well as how you see that how trauma has impacted and led to his substance use, which obviously is very correlated in life. I did want to focus on grief narratives. One of our collaborators also, broke apart some grief narratives. So that's something you'll hear a bit more. But before we get into grief narratives, because I think we have a lot of examples for that, did you have any other general mental health narratives that you wanted to shout out that maybe we missed so far?
Yeah, so I was trying to think of some older ones since what we were saying before, and I thought of one that I can't believe neither of us have really talked about before, and it's one of your all-time favorite horror movies, which is A Nightmare on Elm Street.
This is true.
And looking at it, you can really break it down to being like, all right, well, Freddy was a, child molester. We're going to say child murderer. They kind of don't explicitly state it, but considering how he acts in the afterlife, I'm assuming child molester. And all the characters who he is killing are the children that he had previously assaulted. And they have all repressed it and forgotten him. And now, as adults, those memories are coming back as he comes back to haunt them. And you can almost see it as them having their memories being unrepressed and then them suffering from PTSD at this point in their life or, other types of trauma. And I just thought that was a really neat one that I haven't really dove into too much. And I wonder if you've thought about it since you love that movie.
I don't think about that critically at all. I'm just I'm having fun with this guy looking someone through the phone.
I mean, and look at Dream Warriors. They're all in a children's psychiatric ward.
Yeah, very true.
Goddamn.
I think they made it very clear that was
Wes Craven had a brain on him. We knew that, though. All right.
I did also want to mention, obviously, Saint Maud. There's quite a bit about psychosis.
Big yikes on that movie. Really big fan, but whew.
We did talk about that.
Yeah.
And I think The Lighthouse is another recent one that's very fun, kind of showing the descent into madness of two different people and how their own perceptions of reality impact one another.
Oh, yes. If you read it that way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one that doesn't have a very clear answer. But I know that you wanted to talk about grief narratives a bit. So.
Oh, yes. I mean, they obviously work so well within horror because, death is a big thing.
And I feel like people have been getting kind of PO'd with grief narratives in horror anymore because they're I see this all the time. And some of them don't do it very well, but the ones that do it well fucking rock.
Fine. I see this all the time, but why don't we talk about a movie I loved, an old one again, which would be The Vanishing, aka Traceless, the original one. My goodness, that was maybe one of the most upsetting movies about grief and obsession and lack of closure.
Well, that's also a good one.
Made my whole stomach hurt really bad when it ended.
That also falls under the violence against women narrative because holy shit.
Very true. That's a fantastic movie, and I would highly recommend people out there watch it. And they probably would never think about it. Not the Michael Keaton one or whoever was in it.
I don't know who the
fuck
Michael
was in
Keaton.
the American I don't even know. Don't worry about who's in the American. Watch the original. It's called Traceless or The Vanishing.
It's not in English, but it's incredible. It's worth the subtitles.
If you take anything away from this episode.
It's a little slow burny, so I know some people have trouble with it, but I thought
up your attention span.
One of the most powerful, agonizing movies that we've watched in a while. I
agree.
Yeah.
So, okay, but tangent aside, what do you got?
Well, I know one of your favorites, Midsummer, and Hereditary both fall into this extremely well. We have episodes on both of those, so I guess we don't need to dive too deep.
Yes.
The Babadook, obviously.
Babadook changed my life.
That is easily one of my favorite horror movies ever.
Yep.
Especially the turn of the century.
One of the ones that scared me the most too. While also nailing this grief narrative better than I think I've seen in most movies. While being very on the nose, it just completely nails it.
Yeah. It's incredible. I love The Babadook so much. Yep. We'll be putting out an episode about the 10 best horror movies of the century, and you will see that on my list.
I imagine it'll be on mine too.
A Ghost Story.
Love that movie. Not exactly a horror movie. Made me hurt a lot.
Yeah.
If we've not covered that, I'd love to. I think it would do terribly, so we probably won't. But just a really cool movie where you see grief from the perspective of the person that died.
Yeah.
The deceased, which
is so unique.
As someone who has lost people that are close to them, that one really hurt and got me under my skin in a good way. It made me feel good too. So.
And Lake Mungo does a bit of that as well.
Yep.
And that is more directly a horror film. The Surrender is a horror movie that came out this year on Shudder, which is very much about the reactions to losing a family member. I do recommend that. The Haunting of Hill House, as we mentioned,
shout out again.
Has great grief narratives. And even A Quiet Place has, this family's reaction to grief and this traumatic event.
Completely agree. That's a good pick. I didn't think about that one.
Do you have any others that you would want to add? Anything else that you would want to piece out?
No, because The Vanishing, I think, is such a good example that I just thought of now that I don't want to add anything else.
You're like, I'm done.
Yeah.
I've done my due
I've done my
diligence.
part. Yeah.
That's fair.
Well, I am, like you said, I'm trying to only think of old. So when it comes
since
up
I'm touching so many new things. Yeah. Well, I think we can kind of leave our piece there. If any of these, like, specific subgenres or something that you would like to hear us talk about on a future episode or a TikTok post or something, definitely let us know, because we can definitely dive into these subjects in more depth. I know today was very much like a broad overview.
We're just here to do the intro for the real stars of the show today, which is all of our collaborators. So
yeah, we are very excited to have Gutted Podcast, Spooky Sips, Movies and Us, Red Treehouse, Halloween Babies, and Revisionist Almanac on the show. Some of them are returning guests and some are new.
So shout out all them, and make sure you go follow and like and subscribe and comment and bookmark and repost.
All of the things. But without further ado, here are our podcast friends.
Hello and welcome to the Gutted segment on Horror Hour with the Hannas. I am Elise.
And I'm Tony, and we're here to spill our guts about horror films. We want to thank Horror Hour with the Hannas for having us on their September show.
We really commend Matt and Hannah for tackling such a heavy subject this month.
When we first heard the topic, we panicked a little bit because we are not mental health professionals.
We're not.
One's own mental health and mental health history is a deeply personal and unique experience.
I kind of thought, who are we to talk about anything in this area?
The best thing about horror is that it is a genre that does not shy away from certain topics. There are really a lot of different taboos that filmmakers are trying to explore for a lot of different reasons. And sometimes it is very successful in tackling certain subjects or talking about certain subjects, and sometimes it misses the mark. We are here to talk about our relationship with horror movies and how it broaches the hard to talk about topics.
Right, so those hard to talk about subjects such as relationship trauma, SA, grief, or depression, really good depictions of these topics can help one feel seen or represented in their thoughts or ideologies. And some bad depictions can be irritating at the very least, or feel stereotypical or further stigmatize a group of people. So we are going to stick to what we know and talk about a subject that was very personal to us in the recent past. I would say in the past 5 years or so. Tony and I have struggled with fertility and infertility since the past 5 years.
For those of you who do not know us or do not know our podcast, we are a married couple. These are some issues that we have personally had, and things that until you sort of go through it, you don't really realize how it affects you and your mental health and your emotional well-being. But as horror fans, we were able to sort of find a little bit of comfort in watching other people go through maybe a more extreme version of what we went through.
And I would say sometimes the extremity of horror, it hyperbolizes the feelings that you're already going through. And it's not a substitute for seeking professional help or receiving professional help. But definitely for me personally, I felt seen when I saw certain subjects represented in ways that represented my feelings, even if it was in a very hyperbolic manner.
And I know there was a couple of movies that you wanted to touch on.
Yeah, actually there are quite a few movies that deal with fertility and family. A lot more in the recent past have come out dealing with those subjects that are probably a bit better. And then going back through the decades in the past, you start seeing the ones that could be a bit problematic. And they are perhaps products of their time, perhaps products of quote unquote traditional family makings of the time. Should we go over some of the bad examples first or the good examples first?
Let's go over some of the bad examples.
Okay.
And what is it that makes it bad? Is it just the writer or filmmaker not really thinking about the subject, or is it something about the film being a little more exploitative?
I think a combination of filmmakers trying to push the boundaries, filmmakers perhaps being products of their time, such as in the 80s or the 90s or the aughts, and certain subjects not really being in the limelight in those time periods.
So the first film that we are going to talk about is The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, directed by Curtis Hanson and written by Amanda Silver.
First of all, I love The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. It was one of my childhood staples. I loved Rebecca De Mornay's character and her performance. But I will say, watching this in the recent past, I did start to think, oh, poor Rebecca De Mornay. It's not her fault that she doesn't have a child. And she was pushed in the film to extreme measures, not condoning her character's decisions in the movie whatsoever. But it does feel a bit like it's villainizing the female in the movie that cannot have children or does not have children.
I mean, it's interesting that you're seeing it from that angle, because if you watch the movie, then Rebecca De Mornay's character is the villain. So you're actually feeling bad for her,
yes,
and like almost giving her a pass for why she's terrorizing this family.
Not giving her a pass at all, but I do feel for her. Watching her character in the 90s versus watching it now. In the 90s, I thought, oh man, she's evil. But watching it now, I'm just like, oh no, she needs help. This is what she's turned to cope with her own trauma.
Yeah, so that is an interesting way to look at it through that lens. Of course, it's like you don't condone the actions that she took, but you're trying to understand what or why she got to that place that she was in. And yeah, maybe in that time, we weren't thinking as a society as much about our own mental health or seeking help. This is the writer's imagination of how things went back then.
How things spiral, right?
Yeah.
If you can't become a mother, then you just automatically become this evil woman. Looking at her performance now, it is a lot more nuanced than I thought as a child in the 90s. So perhaps a stigmatizing or hackneyed depiction of a woman who can't have a child, although I do still commend Rebecca De Mornay's performance.
And there's another movie that we have recently watched within the last year or two. It is a French extremity film called À l'intérieur. Sorry about my pronunciation on that, but it is the English version is called Inside, and this was written by Alexandre Bustillo and Julien Maury. Also, forgive my pronunciations. And this was a really interesting film that also dealt with motherhood and fertility.
Just a little backtrack here. When we were dealing with our issues of infertility, and it was very present and bubbling in our own minds and bodies, I was trying to consume as much as I could, as many movies as I could that dealt with this subject. And that was my own coping mechanism. I'm not recommending that for anybody else in this situation. It was just what I wanted to do at that time. La Interior came up, or Inside came up, and I was watching it with this thought process and these feelings in mind. At first I was thinking, oh man, this is actually a really good home invasion movie, which is one of my favorite subgenres. I loved the quote unquote villain in the movie. I was very invested in this movie until, small spoiler, the main villain, the woman who breaks into the house, she kills a cat. And I was like, no, I am lost. I am not sold on this movie. There's no way this woman who so desperately wants a child would kill this innocent cat. Speaking of, our cats are rambunctiously frolicking in the background, so apologies for those sounds. But that's when I was lost on the movie, even though I know this could be considered French extremity, and perhaps the filmmakers were trying to make any scene that would be jarring to the audience, which would include this woman killing a cat heartlessly. It still took me out of it. I thought, no, that she wouldn't do this.
Well, were there any qualities of this film that made you think about the issues that we were talking about? Or is it just they kill the cat and that's it? You're done?
I will say that did distract me from the main point. Even now, it still distracts me. Can't kill the cat. That's what made me lost on this character. She became so evil, so heartless. She wasn't just a woman who couldn't have a child. she just became this two-dimensional, flat-out evil character that was just there to terrorize this poor pregnant woman who was at home alone.
Yeah, so it seems like when a character is depicted in this two-dimensional way, it becomes a little bit less of a character that you can associate with, especially if you're going through something and if you're consuming something to sort of cope with your grief or your loss.
Right. And I would say on the other end, even if you aren't going through this grief or this loss, or you haven't ever experienced any infertility or fertility issues, seeing this two-dimensional character of a woman who can't have child or who struggles with infertility, seeing her less than human is not doing anyone any favors. And it further stigmatizes this group of people. And it makes people who are going through infertility wonder if perhaps the rest of society views you as this way in a less hyperbolized way.
Yeah, very interesting. And also, a very interesting film. I agree with you on that. It went into that direction and it could have been really great. Still a film that I thought was really interesting to watch, but looking at it from your point of view, I can understand why you kind of have those thoughts.
A lot of these two-dimensional characters of these villainized infertile women, I feel like they do stem from folklore, like Baba Yaga, who was this, I think, witch type character from Slavic folktales, who I believe was in the forest and ate children. I took one Russian children's literature class in college, and that's all I can remember from that. There's also, we all know the witch from Hansel and Gretel, where she lured young children to her house and she threw them in the oven to eat them. So there are all these folk tales or fairy tales where older witchy women who don't have children are luring children or trying to steal children and do nefarious things with them, such as eat them. So I feel like these fairy tales from, centuries ago, they have transpired to more modern forms of entertainment and have continued. And it wasn't until recently where I feel like more movies are starting to diversify in that depiction of infertile women.
I know that there was one that you have been kind of talking about quite a bit. We saw it on Shudder, on the Shudder channel. It is called Birth Rebirth. Fabulous movie, directed and co-written by Laura Moss. What is it about this film that spoke to you or something that sparked your interest?
I loved this movie. It was one of my favorite movies of 2023. It might have been my favorite movie of 2023. I feel like it did such a great job of showing or depicting a spectrum of fertility or a spectrum of motherhood, parenthood, and alternate family dynamics. We not only have the central mother who had her only child through IVF, through in vitro fertilization, and then that child dies. So she's dealing with the grief and the loss of her only child. And then on the other end, we have another character who is a scientist, played by Marin Ireland, and she can very easily get pregnant. There are some things that she does after she gets pregnant. She is very detached emotionally from these fetuses that are inside her and growing. And she does go through certain measures. And I won't spoil it beyond that because I do find both these characters so interesting in how they meet and how they essentially become a family unit, and not in a romantic way, strictly platonic, but they are essentially co-parenting. And I love this movie so much in depicting very quote unquote non-traditional family dynamics and also talking about a variety of fertility.
I really enjoyed this one as well. Another one that I know you wanted to talk about was Huesera, the Bone Woman from 2022.
I do love that one too. And really quickly, I love that one just for the fact that it portrays the anxiety surrounding birth, being a birth mother, and postpartum depression. And that as a mother in film, we don't have to always just see these unwavering, unfaltering, brave, heroic birth mothers, such as Dee Wallace's character in Cujo or Jo Beth Williams' character in Poltergeist. Being a mother is so much more than that. There are so many other ways that one can feel as a mother. Those are great characters, yes, but often I feel like society portrays portrays motherhood as you have to be this unflinching woman ready to lift a car to save your child. Waseda shows a different side of motherhood, which I think is very, very lovely.
And one of the things that I've noticed with movies that have come out recently is that we are getting more of a diversity of the type of filmmakers, where they come from, what their stories are, which is great because now we're getting a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different types of stories.
And yes, all of the movies that we mentioned that are quote unquote the good ones that I enjoyed watching in the past few years, they are from the past few years. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just the ones that were most salient to me in the past 5 years. Yeah, I do love that we are getting more of a diversity in voices and thoughts and feelings, especially when it comes to this topic of fertility and infertility.
Hopefully many more great movies to come. We are sort of in this horror renaissance. The stories that we're getting are becoming more thought-provoking, scarier, gorier. Hopefully there are plenty of good things to come.
I think there are. And once again, I do want to thank Horror Hour with the Hannas for having us record a segment for their show in September. Thank you so much. We are the Gutted Horror Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever you find your podcasts. I am Elise.
And I'm Tony. Thank you so much for listening to this segment.
Hello, this is Spooky Sips Podcast. Thanks so much to the Horror Hour with the Hannas for having us on to be a part of this important conversation. I'm one of the hosts, Yvette, here with my co-hosts, Laura and Brianna.
Hello. Hey. All right. So we are very fortunate because we have our own in-house psychologist. But just remember, she's not a real doctor, but she is a real school psychologist. And she has a lot of amazing things to bring to this really important conversation. So Laura, take it away.
All right. So I thought we would just have a bit of a conversation about mental health and the way that it is portrayed in horror movies, specifically the horror movies that we've talked about so far on our podcast. Mental health comes up so often in the horror movies that we watch. So I'm curious why that is. And so we've talked about so much on this podcast that the scariest part of horror movies is usually not the monsters. It's not the ghosts. It's the human experience and the capacity for humans to endure really tough things from themselves and from other people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
and so
for
I
sure.
think that that's one of the reasons why horror movies so often have people that have been struggling with mental health issues, and that ends up impacting them and being the scariest part of the movie that we see.
Absolutely.
Another reason why I think it comes up so often is that these topics, they've been historically kind of taboo. Talking about having struggles with your mental health, or, you know, being quote unquote not normal or have something wrong with you. We're allowed to talk about having a broken bone or, you know, an illness within your body. But then when it's an illness within your brain, which is a part of your body, people really struggle with that. And it's something that people have a hard time talking about. I do think that's gotten a lot better, but it's still something that there's some stigma around it. And because of that, when horror movies then bring that topic up, it can make you feel a little uncomfortable, a little vulnerable, and then that sets you up to get some of those scary feelings that horror movies are going for. But at the same time, it can be kind of a safer way for people to explore the topic than in their own real life. So say, for example, you might be struggling with thoughts of self-harm, and it's not something that, you know, you feel like you can talk to, but you watch a horror movie. It's a way for you to kind of like look and see what's going on with it, and then maybe be able to ask yourself some questions or be able to seek out help. Horror movies some of them are going to do it in a good way. Some of them are going to do it in a pretty damaging way. So it's just always important to know, like, don't take your advice or your experience of what is normal from a horror movie.
Yes.
No, yeah.
But I think that's a really important thing to consider, is that, like, I think feeling alone in your issues, your disease, seeing it in a movie can make you feel a little less alone.
Yeah. That's something that I think is so helpful for people to know. And that's, you know, in my profession and my experience in the work that I do, it can feel like when you're having these mental health difficulties that you're all alone and that there's something wrong with you and that you're the only one that's going through this and no one will understand. It is so common. People have these struggles to different severities and different intensities, but it is so common. and everybody has struggles at one point in their life.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's important to know that that's your mental health, like getting to you, trying to convince you that you're the only one going through it, when really that's not the case.
Yeah.
So I also thought it was really interesting to think about because we've watched so many horror movies, in thinking about how horror movies, especially in how they approach mental health, can kind of be mirrors of how society as a whole is approaching mental health.
Yeah.
So,
Especially at that time period, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So what's scary in our culture at the time? So and as our understanding of mental health changes, so does how horror movies address mental health too. So in some of the earlier movies that we've watched, like Dr. Caligari and House on Haunted Hill, those approach mental health more like things like madness, fear of institutions, having this paranoia, just because it wasn't as well understood as it is now.
Yeah.
But then you go to the 60s and the 70s. I feel like a lot of the movies we watched then had more themes of people dealing with repression, because I think culturally that's just something that was happening at the time. Repression, alienation. We've talked about this so much, where it used to be mental health was just hysteria.
Yes. Oh, especially for women.
Well,
Yes.
yes, exactly. And so hysteria and not being believed as a woman, those themes come up in the movies we've watched, like Carnival of Souls, Alice Sweet Alice, Psycho, and Carrie. It's more like that's the scary part. And then, 80s and 90s was more because the media had this obsession with violence and serial killers, because it was getting bigger, right? That's when then we start seeing things like the slashers, the slasher movies like Texas Chainsaw, Halloween, Candyman, Scream 7, things like that. And then, from the 2000s to now, a lot more themes of mental health that people are dealing with in the movies, like trauma, self-harm, some suicide contagion that's going on, and then also social media and pressure for success and loneliness. Because with all, the social media rise and stuff, I think culturally we're dealing with that a lot more, like self-image and success pressure.
Yeah.
So I feel like that is kind of reflected back in the horror movies as that's the mental health thing we're dealing with right now.
That's so
true.
interesting, because I wouldn't have thought of it like that, but it's so true. It's like a temperature gauge.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So one thing I just want to point out is let's talk about what kind of goes wrong with the horror movie characters for where their mental health leads to such destruction of themselves and those around them. Because I cannot stress this enough. Most people, again, it's so common, most people that have mental health concerns and difficulties are not going to go on to hurting themselves or others, or being these characters of a horror movie. So what maybe is happening with the horror movie characters that is kind of getting in the way? I think a huge thing we see is they'll feel shame. They feel like they can't disclose what they're going through. They're embarrassed and shamed about it. Or they feel like they're just silent. They can't talk. They feel kind of alone. They're in denial of it. So I think that's a huge thing that's happening more now than it used to, is where people are admitting, yeah, I have anxiety, I have depression, I've had thoughts of, hurting myself, or I feel like I just, can't get out of bed, things like that. People can talk about that now, so that then they can get help. Another thing people do in the movies that can kind of get in the way of that is some substance use, self-medication happens a lot. And that can be pretty harmful. Some films are going to address mental health, I think, in a really in a kind of responsible way. And so that would be, treating things like people harming themselves, harming other people as really a tragic situation that has come from, it's really complex. It's not just that's a bad guy. Yeah. And it comes from nowhere, and all of a sudden they're going to go and they're going to, hurt someone or be violent. So some ones we've watched that I think do a fairly good job of that is Donnie Darko. Makes it seem really complex.
Yes.
I think The Others does it in kind of a shock value way, but it shows that it's really complicated. It's it's not, people aren't just going to go out and then all of a sudden have really dangerous behaviors because they have mental health problems. It's going to be that it's been building for a while and they've been struggling. Ones that actually I think do a pretty bad job of addressing mental health, even though we love these movies. They're some of my favorite movies, but they do a terrible job when you think about it. Sinister.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's such a good movie.
And Seven.
Oh,
Great
So
movies,
think
but
about
yeah.
it. So the I'm thinking the people in Seven where they're going through these really complicated emotional mental health situations, but then it's just like they're reduced to, nah, this is just your one sin.
Yep.
Yeah.
So just be cautious in, I think, like how you're consuming horror movies as they relate to mental health, and just know that some are going to do a good job, some are not.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that the important thing to remember is that there are people to talk to about it, and there is help.
Yeah.
And so, some of the things that the horror movie characters might not have had access to or done very well, or felt like they could do, that led to some, damaging outcomes, are things that can be avoided. So there are like 988 is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. There's also, it's 741-741, which is easy to remember. But that's a national crisis line that you can text. And it's cool because you can just text like the word home or hola, and it's just going to connect you with someone that you can chat with 24/7. Both in the 988 and the 741-741 are 24/7.
Nice.
A lot of good ones would be NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Health. The Trevor Project is a good one, and really local resources in your area.
I was going to say, with you like being in the school system, like
Yeah.
that can be a resource, right?
Yes. Yeah. So if you're a child in, public schools, or if you're on like a college campus, a lot of times the schools can be like your first point of contact for finding someone who can help you right then and there, and also connect you to other people out in the community. But also for adults too, there's more options and help than people, I think, realize. It's just a matter of asking. And if you don't know how to ask, or you feel like you can't ask, get a friend or family member to help you. Like, the important thing is reach out to people. Just know that it's common. Know that you might, you can find like local therapists and people to talk to. And know that sometimes it's going to take a little bit of time to find one that clicks. I think that's a trap people can fall into, where it's like,
Yeah.
they'll find a counselor like, oh, that sucked. It's not for me. I personally have gone to counseling for struggles I've had, and it took me until the third one until I like even bought in. And I know about counseling, but just kind of be aware of signs of it in yourself and in others, and then don't try to solve it on your own. Just know that there's professionals out there to help you, and they want to help you, and they're able to help you. So don't feel like you're alone and trying to struggle with it on your own. That's just really important to remember.
Yeah.
So there we go. That's a little bit of summary of mental health as I feel like we see it in horror movies. And then just some tips for if you or someone is going through stuff.
Oh, I think that's great, because like it's such an important conversation. So we're so glad that we could be here for it. And we can't wait to listen to others about it. And we're glad that it's out there. So thank you. All right.
Well, take care of yourself, everybody.
Hello. We are from the Movies in Us pod. My name is Jen.
And I'm Sarah.
And we're so excited to be a part of this collaboration project that the Hannas are putting together. This is a really meaty and really important topic, and also I love that they're tackling this because it's pretty bold. There's a lot of ways that the mental health narrative goes very wrong in movies, horror movies. And so we're excited to bring some ways we feel like it's been done well that we want to celebrate. So just shout out to Matt and Hanna for organizing this. We're so grateful, so honored to be a part of this. And let's talk mental health narratives and horror, Let's do it.
Yeah, so the piece of this that we thought would be really interesting to explore is grief and how that kind of shows up on the screen, because it shows up on the screen in a lot of different ways. So we have a little collection of movies here. They're all very different from one another, but there's an interesting through line of grief throughout them, and the ways that people handle grief or don't handle grief and the ways that we can, heal and become, a healthier human throughout, and then the ways that we can maybe deal with grief in an unhealthy way that actually causes some more problems. So yeah, we're excited to dive into our very eclectic little group of movies here.
Yes, indeed. And I think what's particularly interesting is that a lot of times in these, especially in the films that we've brought to the table, grief is the trigger. It's the igniting point where there's a lot of things that get drawn out of some of our characters and what happens to them and the choices that they make that lead them to some horrifying things. But the root source as a through line through all of these films is grief being kind of that starting point of triggering that journey that they go on. So Sarah, tell me some of the movies that you've brought that cover this topic area and show themselves in horrifying ways.
Yeah, so when I first read this prompt from Matt and Hannah, the first two movies that popped into my head were Midsommar and Hereditary. And I would imagine that these will probably pop up for quite a few people because there is so much here specifically about grief, but also touching on different forms of mental health and mental illness. I think Midsommar is a really interesting one because it starts out with Dani processing through just a horrifying amount of grief with the death of her sister and her parents and falling into such a deep depression. And even the way that the opening bit is filmed, it's very dark and gray, and you feel her isolation. You feel the crushing weight of her grief in that moment. And then we also realize that she's alone in it because her boyfriend sucks. He's the literal worst. And he wants to break up with her, but can't because of this. And now he has to begrudgingly be with her as she's processing through this really, really tragic circumstance. And then the movie really, we dive into some wild horror from there once they are overseas. But I even think, I even think the ending of it is really interesting too, because she's obviously in a very different place, having suffered even more tragedies once she's no longer in the US. But it ends on this her being accepted into community and being welcomed in, which I think is a really interesting place for the film to end, considering that it started with her being in such seclusion and isolation and in a really, really bad place. I don't know that she's in a great place by the end of the film, having gone through everything she goes through, but it's interesting that now she is in a place with community and it feels like there is life there where the beginning of the film feels very lifeless. So I just appreciate the way that Midsommar really highlights how being alone in your grief and being isolated can actually make things worse, and being able to find people to sit in that grief with you is a helpful part of the healing process.
This is a great choice. Yeah. Midsommar is a whole journey, and I'm really curious if other people are going to bring this to the table too, and what dimensions that they draw out of it. But there's such a vulnerability that I think she has to being preyed upon because of the state that she's in at the beginning of that film that leads her to kind of descending into this world on the overseas land, that they encounter. So yeah, this is a really great choice. Do you have another that you would like to bring to the table?
Yes, my other one is also by Ari Aster called Hereditary. And again, this is a film where there's so much grief in this. The movie begins with Toni Collette's character, Annie. Her dies. And as a result, Annie, just throws herself into work that just becomes her whole life is just her work. And that is one way that a lot of people cope with grief. I am a workaholic, and that tends to be the way that I go. And so, that happens. And then throughout the film, there is another very, very tragic death that happens. I'm not going to spoil who dies, but it's very, very tragic. And then things spiral out of control. And in her quest to seek answers, things go even more wrong from there. But for me, Hereditary is a really interesting movie, highlighting that desire that we have for control. And when we experience a loss or we experience a grief, it's so tempting to want to regain control wherever we can. And again, workaholic, recovering control freak. I relate to Annie a lot in that film, which I don't know that you really should. But I think that Hereditary is a really interesting look in grief, especially through the horror lens, and the way that horror is introduced as a result of her grief, I think is pretty interesting.
And I think that's why this medium and this genre is so powerful, because it exaggerates and saturates a lot of those tendencies or experiences that we have on our own, where we can relate to and see the kind of the horrors of if this experience is made more big and more whole, what does that look like, and what is kind of the costs of that? So great picks. Love it. Love it.
Mm-hmm. And you have some very interesting picks, because both of mine are firmly in the horror genre. They're both directed by Ari Aster. So there's some interesting parallels between those two. But you have some very interesting movies to bring to our little collection here that I'm very excited to talk about.
Yes, I've got two. So the first one that came to mind when I thought about grief in horror, and I'm using air quotes the horror because it's horror thriller. People might argue this differently, but it's the film A Ghost Story, directed by David Lowery. Big David Lowery films out here. This film is so beautifully poetic, and it tackles the theme of grief, but kind of spins it on its head and subverts a lot of expectations. So obviously it's about a ghost, the ghost of a dead husband that is stalking, haunting his wife, but it actually plays with that idea in showcasing the ways that he's almost there watching and reminiscing on all of the times they had together. And so it's this weird sense of eeriness and something haunting and terrifying about his presence, but also showcases how when we lose people in our lives, the void that creates is haunting, and it is that presence is constantly felt. And so this film takes, I think, a lot of our expectations around what we would expect from a film titled A Ghost Story about a deceased husband and his wife, and plays with our expectations and maybe molds and shapes how we might have thought about where this film is going. And it's a really beautifully poetic film, as I mentioned, but also there's this unsettling feeling that I think everyone who's lost someone and had to grieve the void of someone has felt, that presence, that kind of they can't leave them. And what does that look and feel like? And how is that the emotions that come with that really difficult and challenging for us to navigate through? So A Ghost Story is one that came to mind, and I think it's a unique one, especially in what we traditionally think about in the horror genre.
Yeah. No, this is a great pick because it taps into, how horrifying that feeling is of being forgotten, and, takes us into what this ghost is experiencing in a really beautiful and thoughtful way, while also not shying away from the grief. The scene in that movie that I think I'm going to forever remember is when she is eating that pie, and it's so tender, it's so sorrowful, and it really takes us into all of the emotions that she is feeling and processing in that moment. It's such a good pick. And
it's a great film. Go watch it.
You have another great film that you also thought of with this prompt that I think is a really fascinating way to view this particular topic.
Yeah. So the other film that came to mind is The Substance. I'm sure all of the horror people that are listening to this podcast, that are probably in the target audience of this podcast, has definitely seen this film. It's kind of made some really great waves over the past couple of months. And this film, I think, explores the grief of women who are kind of mourning their past selves and past versions of themselves, and having to reckon with the horrors of aging. And I call it the horrors of aging because a lot of what is depicted as the horrors of aging is created by society, created by the beauty industry, and these unrealistic expectations for a lot of women. When in reality, a lot of there's beauty in aging and the fine lines. But what the messaging that often women receive is that this is horrifying and you need to do something about it. And so we see Demi Moore's character go to great lengths in order to combat the horrors that she feels of herself becoming this creature and this older women in society, and her having to take action and to take things into her own hands and take action to combat that. And so the grief in this film, I think, is showcased so much in especially that the opening section where we see how difficult and uncomfortable Demi Moore feels in her own skin as she looks in the mirror and doesn't like what she sees. And so I love that this film takes a very real experience dynamic that so many women feel and that emotion, and kind of showcases the lengths that we might go to do the things to our bodies that is truly horrifying. And so I think this is a fascinating film and really, really exciting to see on the big screen, especially as a woman. I felt so seen by this, and I think it's making so many people wake up to just the horrors of the messaging that we give to a lot of women in the world today.
Oh, it's such a good pick. And I do love that thread of grief that is in the film. You know, there's a lot of themes in that film. There's a lot of messages in that film, and they're all great and interesting to think about and unpack. But I think at the center of it is that grief that you were talking about of what used to be, what she used to look like, the influence that she used to have, the fans that she used to have, and grieving that, and maybe even like grieving what will never be because now her career is over. And so what do you do when you're in that place? And I mean, none of us are famous movie stars, likely, or only a few people in the world are famous movie stars that experience that specific thing. But I feel like we've all had that season of grieving a past season or grieving, a loss of a dream or something. So that's all in that movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's our collection of 4 picks to bring to the table and kind of explore this theme of grief and how it can trigger so many instincts and desires and horrors in each of us and lead us to horrifying things sometimes. And yeah, this is a really meaty topic. We're so grateful for the Hannas for tackling this and bringing together so many voices and perspectives of the way that this very important part of who we are as humans and how that has come to life and explored in this medium and in this genre specifically. So shout out to the Hannas. I guess we'll leave with like where you can find more of Movies and Us and all that goodness on the interwebs.
Yeah, so listen to Movies and Us wherever you get your podcasts, Movies and Us, and we're on YouTube. So follow us on YouTube at Movies and Us Pod. Same thing with all the socials, Threads, TikTok, Blue Sky, Instagram. I think that's all of them at Movies and Us Pod. So come hang out with us and let's talk movies together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you to the Hannas, and can't wait to hear what everyone else brings to the table next. So we'll play the next segment after this.
Hey everyone, this is Will, host of the Red Treehouse and One Good Scare. One of the most common questions I get when someone finds out I love horror movies is why. And that's usually followed up with a statement like, "That's so dark and evil." Or a second question like, "Why would you choose to scare yourself?" I've often said, and still firmly believe, that horror movies offer us a chance to look deeply into things we otherwise might avoid or turn away from. The best horror movies, those we think about after the movie ends, the ones we get excited about watching repeatedly, and the ones we recommend to other people, often have deep themes dealing with grief, trauma, relationships, and mental health. And that last one, mental health, is a common theme in so many horror movies. But if we're honest, so often the depictions of mental health in horror movies is stigmatizing and based more on stereotypes than reality. And it would be far too easy for me to pick out a handful of horror movies that do a terrible job of portraying mental health. Instead, I want to take a different route. I want to highlight a movie that does a terrific job of navigating it deftly. The Sixth Sense. Now it's kind of ironic, because M. Night Shyamalan generally does a really shitty job of portraying mental health in his movies. A few examples of terrible depictions include The Visit, Split, Glass, and Trap. But his first movie, The Sixth Sense, is a really beautiful film that explores themes of bullying, loneliness, broken relationships, generational trauma, loss, and grief. Obviously, for the sake of time, we won't unpack each of these. But I want to focus on 3 key scenes that handle these themes with a gentle hand. The first scene is the kitchen scene. First off, Toni Collette and Haley Joel Osment both deserved Oscars for their roles of Lynn and Cole Sears. The setup for this scene is simple. Cole sees ghosts, and he's sitting at the table eating a bowl of cereal. Lynn walks in and Cole is stiff as a board, his hands plastered to the kitchen table. The ghost has opened nearly every kitchen cabinet and drawer. Lynn is shocked, and in this wide-pan shot, we see her standing on the left and Cole sitting on the right. He says he was looking for Pop-Tarts, and then he asks her what she's thinking. She says, "Lots of things," and he responds, "Anything bad about me?" She responds and gets close to him and says, "Look at my face. I was not thinking anything bad about you." He says okay, and the doorbell rings. One of the neighborhood kids, Tommy, is there to get Cole for school. She calls him back as he runs off and hands him the Pop-Tarts he was allegedly looking for. And as he takes off for the front door, we see his sweaty palm print on the tabletop. Now look, this scene is no more than 90 seconds, but it's beautiful because we see both characters emotionally embodying not just their characters, but the pain of those characters. We see the stress and anxiety on Lynn's face, we hear the exasperation in her response to Cole. This is a single mother who's really going through it and is just doing the best she can. And we can see and feel Cole's fear and uncertainty, first from seeing the ghost, but mostly because he's worried that his mother thinks bad things about him. This is no doubt born out of the bullying he's experienced from the neighborhood kids. M. Night's soft directorial touch goes a long way to building a strong emotional foundation and connection between Lynn and Cole. And frankly, it's one thing to tell the viewer this character struggles with this mental or emotional issue, and it's another thing entirely to show the nuance and complexity of this. And in this scene, we see that subtlety. The second scene is the second kitchen scene. About an hour into the movie, we're once again back in the kitchen as Lynn and Cole sit for dinner. The thermostat is acting up, and in a wide-pan shot, Lynn confronts Cole about the bumblebee pendant she found in his dresser drawer. The tension and frustration and sadness is palpable as she tells him that it belonged to her mother and that it could have been broken. Cole responds, "You cry 'cause you miss Grandma so much." Stabbing at the asparagus on her plate, Lynn responds, "That's right." Cole tries to subtly tell his mother that he didn't move the pendant, and when she asks him directly, he tells her no. Then he says, "Don't get mad." She presses him on how it ended up in his drawer, her voice oozing frustration. Cole, knowing that it was a ghost who moved it, says, "Maybe." Lynn then explains that she's tired, in her body, in her mind, and in her heart. She says she needs help, that their family isn't doing so good. She's praying, but it's not working. She says they need to help each other, and that they need to talk to each other or they won't make it. She asks him again about the pendant, and reassures him that she won't get mad. But Cole says he didn't move it. Lynn sends him away from the dinner table, the scene climaxing in her yelling, "Go!" Once again, the soft directorial touch allows us to see the complexity of Lynn's situation. Cole is actually telling his mother the truth. But because she doesn't understand, she doesn't believe him. In a single scene, we see Lynn's underlying grief and sadness, both with the loss of her mother and their current financial struggles. And we see Cole's apprehension towards his mother. He beats around the bush about how the pendant got in his drawer, and he stops short of telling his mother he sees ghosts. This single scene shows us how grief and financial difficulty can impact our mental health and relationships. And though the scene plays out as a miscommunication between Lynn and Cole, the heart of it is actually much deeper, because sometimes we have trouble communicating, not because of a lack of clarity, but because of a lack of safety. And that safety is a two-way street. Lynn wants to get to the heart of the issue. She asks Cole multiple times to tell her the truth. And Cole does, but his statement, "Don't get mad," reveals a lack of safety. And so he stops short of fully explaining, which leads to the miscommunication between the two. And our third scene is the car scene, which to me is one of the most beautiful scenes in any movie, horror or otherwise. In it, we see Lynn and Cole sitting in traffic because there was an accident up ahead of them. Cole tells Lynn that a lady died, and Lynn tries to figure out how he knows that. Finally, he tells her that the dead woman is standing next to his window. Lynn, realizing what's happening, says he's scaring her, and he says that the ghosts scare him too sometimes. She asks him, "You see ghosts, Cole?" And he says, "They want me to do things for them. They're the ones that used to hurt me." He then asks her, "What are you thinking, Melma? You think I'm a freak?" She reacts and says, "I would never think that about you, ever." Then Cole tells her, "Grandma says hi." Lynn looks him right in the eye, her eyes wide as could be, as Cole says, she's sorry for taking the bumblebee pendant. She likes it a lot. Grandma comes to visit me sometimes. Lynn says, "Cole, that's very wrong. Grandma's gone, you know that." Then he says, "She wanted me to tell you she saw you dance." And that right there opens the floodgates. I've said this already, but this scene is just beautiful. Cole is navigating his mother's grief and loss as she cries, catharsis settling in. The two then embrace and sob arm in arm. Look, for me, this is the real climax of the movie. I know Bruce Willis's character has some loose ends to tie up, but this final scene between Lynn and Cole shows the true-to-life catharsis when we speak our truth fully to those we love and care about. After avoiding it for most of the movie, Cole finally tells his mother about his gift, and rather than fixate on the fear it brings, he offers his truth as a balm to heal his mother's wounds. And in that moment, if only for a minute, Lynn's heartache was eased as she grappled with her grief and loss. You know, I've worked in the mental health and substance abuse spaces for many years, and in the vast majority of cases, healing and growth often come quietly, much like the car scene with Lynn and Cole. And it's usually incremental. It's experienced in stages that sometimes look like quarter or half steps more than large leaps. And there's something beautiful about taking that journey towards wholeness, and in walking alongside others as they do. And here's the thing. All of this was from 3 short scenes in a horror movie. So the next time someone asks why you love horror movies, point them to The Sixth Sense and remind them that horror movies sometimes have beautiful things to say about the world around us and the world within us. Again, I'm Will, host of the Red Treehouse and One Good Scare. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me.
Hello, listeners. I am Billy D, host of the Halloween Babies podcast. Why Halloween Babies? Because I was born on Halloween, I'm a lifelong horror fan, and although I've not been diagnosed, I've definitely got a little Arrested Development going on. On Halloween Babies podcast, I give solo mini reviews of just about everything I watch or read, as well as occasionally releasing deep dive, spoiler-heavy thematic dissections of films that I feel don't get as much love or attention that they deserve. I'd like to thank the Hannas for asking me to contribute to their mental health episode, so let's dive in. What I find appealing about mental health and mental illness narratives is that they deal with one of the most horrific aspects of the human condition, the evil within. Uncertainty, introspection, and dangerously intrusive thoughts can create a pattern of existential crisis that can weigh heavily upon our shoulders and push us down into the swamps of sorrow. we start to question the reality of our existence as our past ghosts haunt our intuition and perceptions, and our past scars build barriers of discontent, resentment, frustration, and confusion. When a writer understands those subtle nuances and their script reflects trauma and grief in a way that allows the viewer to understand the plight of its characters, it lets us sympathize with the dark thoughts that linger in the shadows of our subconscious and affect our waking life in subtle ways at first, but can eventually become crippling. We often ask ourselves, am I crazy, or is it the world that is crazy? One recent film that asked that very question is Parker Finn's follow-up to Smile, Smile 2. Naomi Scott as Sky Riley has a dream life that turns into a nightmare when confronted with her trauma as she battles sobriety and the pressure of fame as the machine of her career gets bigger and bigger. Sometimes those of us who seem the happiest are actually hiding all our pain behind a smile, one that gets bigger and bigger as the pain becomes more unbearable. Am I crazy, or is it the world that is crazy? As a person who has struggled with mental illness since my formative years, I would say the answer to that question is a little bit of both. At times, mental illness can make us feel like the protagonist and antagonist of our own stories, whether we recognize a hopeless disturbance in the force around us or the dark shapes that exist within. Our fear responses can be varied and interpreted many different ways. David Cronenberg has built a career based heavily on the demons within that manifest as painful transformations that often become the harbingers of doom and our eventual demise. Of course, the film industry is still an industry and it exists to make money. So sometimes very little thought is put into the representations and consequences of using a mental health narrative as the crux of the story, delivering a caricature with no depth or introspection that may come across as myopic and stigmatizing. But sometimes artists are not wholly motivated by money. Sometimes they live for the story, and sometimes they live within the story. In 2002, writer-director Andrew Getty started production on a film about a mentally handicapped boy who befriends his reflection that turns out to be a demonic creature coaching him to go on a murderous rampage. Getty, who suffered from not only mental illness but an addiction to methamphetamine, would eventually die from his addiction 2 years before his film, The Evil Within, was released. He ended up funding most of the film's production cost himself, creating the film's effects, and obsessing over each and every frame. The Evil Within becomes a strange, surreal, and absurd carnival as it starts to remind me of Pee-wee's Playhouse, presented through the lens of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Art imitates life, and sometimes life can get out of control. Of course, I do believe it's not every artist's motivation to become the proverbial ethical pallbearer of daintily and inoffensively delivering the dark arts of humanity to the screen. Films like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and Michael Powell's Peeping Tom try to elicit fear of a strange and disturbed man who wants to cause you harm, but they also invoke a level of pathos to the proto-slasher narrative that seems to be more interestingly nuanced and poignant than would become present in most of the 1980s cash grabs of that inspired sub-genre. Yes, we fear Norman dressed as his mother, holding a knife, and we fear Mark with his camera and deadly pointed tripod, but we also sympathize and in a way offer up at least a modicum of forgiveness. The things that traumatized them as children have now become not only their weapons, but their armor. Understanding the beast within shines light on our humanity. Understanding the sickness helps us find a cure, or at least helps us to set up a protocol of pathways that lead us away from the darkness and into the light. That brings me to the dreaded and stigmatized S word, suicide. 2 films that came out in the past 5 years that I absolutely loved and hit me hard right in the spot where my heart and soul collide, deal with suicidal thoughts, each in its own unique way. In 2020, David Bruckner directed a film called The Night House, written by Ben Collins and Luke Piotrowski, starring the amazing Rebecca Hall as Beth, a young woman who just lost her husband to suicide. As Beth searches for the reason for Owen's self-imposed departure, she discovers that the darkness that has been following her since a near-fatal accident she was in as a teenager manifests itself as a demon that spends years haunting her husband, who in turn tries to satiate the demon by tricking it with doppelganger sacrifices and reversed architecture. Sadly, in the end, his ritualistic and violent attempts at salvation became too much for him. The film presents suicide and dark intrusive thoughts as a possessing entity, something that can be transferred to a loved one who is trying to be understanding by taking the burden upon themselves. It is a dark meditation on grief, suffering, and acceptance, and shows that even when we survive a traumatic event, the dark shadow of despair is always present and always sitting right next to us, undulating on a boat afloat in the river Styx. Another dark and depressing meditation, this time on the hopelessness and mundane repetitive nature of life that can leave some crippled with anxiety and dread, is 2024's The Devil's Bath. From Severin Fiala and Veronica Franz, the duo behind Goodnight Mommy and The Lodge, the lead performance by Anja Plasch as Agnes is quite impressive, particularly as the film goes along and we watch as her wide-eyed optimism is quickly soured by the drudgery of married life, and she becomes a husk of a person who almost wills her body to stop functioning. Set in 18th century Austria, the only thing Agnes has to look forward to is her upcoming wedding and a hopefully quick conception so she can embark on the dream of motherhood. But this new life is one of hardship, especially with an overbearing mother-in-law and a husband who much rather prefers the companionship of men. This is not what Agnes signed up for. In fact, it is bullshit. Inspired by the book Suicide by Proxy in Early Modern Germany by Kathy Stewart, the film reflects upon the real-life phenomenon of women who wanted to die, but knowing that they cannot pass through the gates of heaven after suicide, they choose instead to murder children and confess in order to be spiritually exonerated by a priest before being publicly executed. When Agnes finally does receive her moment of redemption, the emotion that pours out of her is almost too real, and this particular scene was amazingly shot in one take. The film also has a lot to say about how the masses can at times rejoice in the pain of others, as misfortune for some can be viewed as good luck to others as they drink your blood and place your severed fingers under their pillows to sweeten their dreams. Both of these films deal with mental illness and suicide, but in a way, they also deal with self-preservation, at least in terms of a hopeful redemption. Ironically, that redemption comes with the price of sacrifice. In The Night House, Beth's husband Owen seduces women that mirror his wife's image, murders them, and buries them under the floor of his secret second home. In a way, the audience becomes the possessive demon demanding bloodshed. We are the nothingness whispering in the darkness. As horror fans, we are always talking about the kills, the body count, the gore, and the buckets of blood. In The Devil's Bath, when Agnes is tied to the sacrificial stake on a stage in front of her village, her throat is slit and the villagers scream and dance with delight. They drink from the bloody cup of communion and take home memorabilia from a pre-cinema horror convention. They are us, we are them. God is an astronaut, Oz is over the rainbow, and Midian is where the monsters live.
Hey everybody, it is Andrew here from the Revisionist Almanac. I just want to take a moment and I want to thank Matt and Hanna for having me back once again for one of their really incredible collaboration projects. I think mental health and mental illness in horror is a very provocative but sensitive subject that does deserve to be talked about. I want to be very clear that I'm going to be approaching this strictly from my very subjective point of view, and every other person's opinion, whether they agree or disagree with me, is completely and fully validated. Now, my first appearance on Horror Hour with the Hannas was earlier this year in 2025, and it was for a movie that deals with the subject matter that we're talking about right here head on. That was, of course, Darren Aronofsky's film Black Swan from the year 2010. Now, I'm not so sure that Darren Aronofsky handled the subject matter in the most delicate nature, but I do think Natalie Portman's portrayal, which did win her an Academy Award, brought a great deal of light to the genre and the idea you could tackle this kind of material for a general audience. I think what makes horror the most interesting of all film genres out there is that almost every movie made has a lot of thematic weight to it, whether it's right there on the surface or if it's baked much deeper in and it forces you as a viewer to go mining in for yourself. But because horror is such a large genre with so much history in it, there are absolutely films that, in my opinion, do a poor, a sloppy, or a downright offensive job portraying mental illness on screen. However, instead of drawing attention to those movies, I'd rather focus on the positives and devote my time here to two specific movies that I think do a great job in dealing with it. The first movie is one of my favorite films of the last 10 years in any film genre, that being Ari Aster's 2019 folk horror masterpiece, Midsommar. Beyond just being an incredible movie, the central character, played by Florence Pugh, begins the film having to deal with the immense trauma and guilt brought on by her sister taking her own life and the lives of their parents. This sends the character spiraling and yearning for someone to help her get through a difficult stage in her life. You'd hope that her friends, including her boyfriend, would be there to aid in supporting her, but what makes this movie so intelligent and thought-provoking is that the cult-like religious group we meet later in the film are actually the ones who seem more attuned to her pain and empathize with her need for catharsis. It's a beautiful magic trick Ari Aster pulls off, making you question if there's any black or white to the characters, and if the ending of the film is a good or a bad thing for Dani and her processing of her pain. This is a film I go back to often, multiple times a year as a matter of fact, and each time I find more in it and a greater understanding of the many layers of psychological challenges one faces after an event of such personal magnitude. And the other film I really want to talk about isn't so much in the horror genre, but it's close enough that I had to include it here for this discussion. It is, for my money, the movie that deals with mental health in the most sophisticated way that I have ever seen on screen. That movie is the 2011 film Take Shelter by director Jeff Nichols. The film stars the always incredible Michael Shannon as a man who is continually haunted by visions of the end of the world. It consumes his entire being as he does whatever he can to try and prepare himself and his family for what he believes will be the annihilation of the planet. The main character's own mother is also a paranoid schizophrenic, and he wrestles throughout the film with wondering if what he's seeing is actually happening or if it's all in his head. And the character's wife and daughter also have tremendous trouble understanding his emotional torment and are unable to connect with him since they can't see what he's seeing and experiencing for himself. And the movie also ends with the type of ambiguous ending that I love so much as a film watcher. It doesn't give you easy answers, and it wants you to walk away from the movie trying to unpack what you saw and what the significance of it all was. And Take Shelter isn't nearly as seen as it should be, so I hope you'll take this as a recommendation to discover the way the story plays out for yourself. So there it is, a couple of films that I think deal with mental health and mental illness in a really, really strong, positive, important way. I am sure that everyone else contributing to this project is going to have a whole host of other films that they want to talk about, so I can't wait to hear what everyone else in this discussion brings to the table. Once again, I am so grateful to both Hanna and Matt for bringing this conversation to the forefront. It is always a pleasure being a part of a collaboration process as large as this, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk for a bit. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Horror Hour with the Hannas. Make sure to listen to future episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever else you can find podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube, where we post episodes and shorts. You can follow us at Horror Hour with the Hannas on TikTok and Instagram, as well as at Horror Hour on Blue Sky for more content. If you like the podcast, please follow and leave a review on your favorite podcasting app. Happy hauntings!